Roosevelt Island is a narrow island in New York City's East River. It lies between Manhattan Island to its west and the borough of Queens on Long Island to its east, and is part of the borough of Manhattan. Running from the equivalent of Manhattan Island's 46th to East 85th Streets, it is about 2 miles long, with a maximum width of 800 feet, and a total area of 147 acres. Together with Mill Rock, Roosevelt Island constitutes Manhattan's Census Tract 238, which has a land area of 0.279 sq mi and had a population of 9,520 in 2000 according to the US Census. The Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation estimated its population was about 12,000 in 2007. The island was called Minnehanonck by the Lenape and Varkens Eylandt by New Netherlanders, and during the colonial era and later as Blackwell US Island. It was known as Welfare Island from 1921 to 1971. It was renamed Roosevelt Island in 1971 after Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt Island is owned by the city, but was leased to the state of New York's Urban Development Corporation for 99 years in 1969. Most of the residential buildings on Roosevelt Island are rental buildings. There is also a cooperative and a condominium building. One rental building has left New York State's Mitchell-Lama housing program, though current residents are still protected. 3 other buildings are now working toward privatization, including the cooperative. History, development. In 1637, Dutch Governor Wouter van Twiller purchased the island, then known as Hog Island, from the Kanazi Indians after the English defeated the Dutch in 1666. Captain John Manning seized the island, which became known as Manning's Island, and 20 years later, Manning's son-in-law, Robert Blackwell, became the island's new owner and namesake. In 1796, Blackwell's great-grandson Jacob Blackwell constructed the Blackwell House, the island's oldest landmark, New York City's 6th oldest house and one of the city's few remaining examples of 18th-century architecture. Through the 19th century, the island housed several hospitals and a prison. In 1828, the city of New York purchased the island for $32,000, and 4 years later, the city erected a penitentiary on the island. The penitentiary hospital was built to serve the needs of the prison inmates. By 1839, the New York City Lunatic Asylum opened, including the Octagon Tower, which still stands but as a residential building. It was renovated and reopened in April 2006. The asylum, which was designed by Alexander Jackson Davis, at one point held 1,700 inmates, twice its design capacity. In 1852, a workhouse was built on the island to hold petty violators in 220 cells. The Smallpox Hospital, designed by James Rennick, Jr., opened in 1856, and 2 years later, the asylum burned down and was rebuilt on the same site. Penitentiary Hospital was destroyed in the same fire. In 1861, prisoners completed construction of Rennick's City Hospital, which served both prisoners and New York City's poorer population. In 1872, the Blackwell Island Light, a 50-foot Gothic-style lighthouse later added to the National Register of Historic Places, was built by convict labor on the island's northern tip under Rennick's supervision. 17 years later, in 1889, the Chapel of the Good Shepherd, designed by Frederick Clark Withers, opened. By 1895, inmates from the asylum were being transferred to Ward's Island, and patients from the hospital there were transferred to Blackwell's Island. The asylum was renamed Metropolitan Hospital. However, the last convicts were not moved off the island until 1935, when the penitentiary on Rikers Island opened. The 20th century was a time of change for the island. The Queensboro Bridge started construction in 1900 and opened in 1909. It passed over the island but did not provide direct vehicular access to it at the time. In 1921, Blackwell's Island was renamed Welfare Island. In 1930, a vehicular elevator to transport cars and passengers on Queensboro Bridge started to allow vehicular and trolley access to the island. In 1939, Goldwater Memorial Hospital, a chronic care facility, opened, with almost 1,000 beds in 7 buildings on 9.9 acres. 13 years later, Bird's Kolar Hospital, another chronic care facility, opened, and 3 years after the Kolar Hospital's opening, Metropolitan Hospital moved to Manhattan, leaving the lunatic asylum buildings abandoned. The same year, 1955, the Welfare Island Bridge from Queens opened, allowing automobile and truck access to the island and the only non-aquatic means in and out of the island. The vehicular elevator to Queensboro Bridge then closed, but wasn't demolished until 1970. More changes came in the latter half of the century. In 1968, the Delacorte Fountain, opposite the headquarters of the United Nations, opened. Mayor John V. Lindsay named a committee to make recommendations for the island's development in the same year. A year later, the New York State Urban Development Corporation signs a 99-year lease for the island, and architects Philip Johnson and John Berge create a plan for apartment buildings housing 20,000 residents. In 1971, Welfare Island was renamed Roosevelt Island in honor of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and 4 years later, planning for his eponymous park, Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park, started. In 1976, the Roosevelt Island Tramway opened, connecting the island directly with Manhattan, but it was 8 years before the New York State Legislature created the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation to operate the tramway, with a 9-person board of directors appointed by the governor, 2 suggested by the mayor of New York City, and 3 of whom are residents of the island. The tramway was meant as a temporary solution to the then lack of subway service to the island, which began in 1989 with the opening of the Roosevelt Island subway station. During the 21st century, the area became more gentrified. In 1998, the Blackwell Island Light was restored by an anonymous donor. In 2006, the restored Octagon Tower opened, serving as the central lobby of a 2-wing, 500-unit apartment building. In 2010, the Roosevelt Island Tramway reopened after renovations. A year later, South Point Park opened south of Goldwater Memorial Hospital, near the island's southern end. The Cornell NYC Tech, a joint venture between Techni and a Euro-Israel Institute of Technology and Cornell University, was announced the same year. In 2012, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park was dedicated and opened to the public as a state park. Construction of the new Cornell NYC Tech campus began in January 2014 with the arrival of equipment on Roosevelt Island for the building of a fence around the construction site and for the demolition of the existing Goldwater Specialty Hospital's South Campus. Demolition began in March 2014, but city officials say they do not have plans to close the North Campus of the hospital. The school plans to begin operations on the island in 2017. Architecture. Though small, Roosevelt Island has a distinguished architectural history. It has several architecturally significant buildings, and has been the site of numerous important unbuilt architectural competitions and proposals. The island's master plan, adopted by the New York State Urban Development Corporation in 1969, was developed by the firm of Philip Johnson and John Berge. The plan divided the island into 3 residential communities, and it forbade the use of automobiles on the island. The plan intended for residents to park their cars in a large garage and use public transportation to get around. Another innovation was the plan's development of a mini-school system, in which classrooms for the island's public intermediate school were distributed among all the residential buildings in a campus-like fashion. The first phase of Roosevelt Island's development was called Northtown. It consists of 4 housing complexes: Westview, Island House, Rivercross, and Eastwood. Rivercross is a Mitchell-Lama co-op, while the rest of the buildings in Northtown are rentals. Eastwood, the largest apartment complex on the island, and Westview were designed by noted architect Joseph Louis Sert, then Dean of Harvard Graduate School of Design. Eastwood, along with Peabody Terrace, is a prime example of Sert's high-rise multiple-dwelling residential buildings. It achieves efficiency by triple-loading corridors with duplex apartment units, such that elevators and public corridors only needed every 3 floors. Island House and Rivercross were designed by Johansson and Bev Nani. The 2 developments were noteworthy for their use of prefabricated cladding systems. Subsequent phases of the island's development have been less innovative, Architecturally, Northtown Phase 2 was developed by the Tract Corporation and designed by the firm, Grues and Sampton, in a pseudo-historical postmodern style. It was completed in 1989, over a decade after Northtown. Southtown is the third phase of the island's development. This phase, also designed by Grues and Sampton, was not started until 1998, and is still in the process of development. When complete, Southtown will have 2,000 units in 9 buildings. The Octagon, one of the Islander Euro-1 registered trademark S6 landmarks, was restored in April 2006, and the National Landmark building is now a high-end apartment community. It also houses the largest array of solar panels on any building in New York City. When the Octagon opened its doors, many young, affluent tenants started to occupy the studios and 1, 2, and 3-bedroom units. 100 of the units therein are set aside for middle-income residents. In 2006, ENYA made the island's abandoned southern end the subject of one of its annual competitions. In addition to Louis Kahn's 4-acre Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park at that tip, whose public dedication on October 17, 2012 was tangled in litigation, the island has also been the site of numerous other architectural speculations. Rem Koolhaas and the Office of Metropolitan Architecture proposed 2 projects for the island in his book Delirious New York: The Welfare Island Hotel and the Roosevelt Island Redevelopment Proposal. That proposal was Koolhaas's entry into a competition held for the development of Northtown Phase 2. Other entrants included Peter E. Senman, Robert A. M. Stern, and Oswald Matthias Unges. As of 2013, 6 of the Southtown buildings, with a total of 1,200 units, have been completed. Residential development of Southtown has brought new retail businesses to Roosevelt Island, including a Starbucks and a Duane Reade. Roosevelt Island has long had a limited variety of restaurants, but as a result of Southtown development, new restaurants appeared: Nono's Focacceria, Fuji East, Riverwalk Bar and Grill and Pier NYC on the West Promenade. Transportation. Although Roosevelt Island is located directly under the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, it is not directly accessible from the bridge itself. A trolley used to connect passengers from Queens and Manhattan to a stop in the middle of the bridge, where passengers took an elevator down to the island. The trolley operated from the bridge's opening in 1909 until April 7, 1957. Between 1930 and 1955, the only vehicular access to the island was provided by an elevator system in the elevator storehouse that transported cars and commuters between the bridge and the island. The elevator was closed to the public after the construction of the Roosevelt Island Bridge between the island and Astoria and Queens in 1955 and demolished in 1970. In 1976, the Roosevelt Island Tramway was constructed to provide access to Midtown Manhattan. New York City subway access to the rest of Manhattan into Long Island City and Queens via the IND 63rd Street line began in 1989, but access to the rest of Queens did not start until 2001. Located more than 100 feet below ground level, the Roosevelt Island Station is one of the deepest stations below sea level in the New York City subway system. Roosevelt Island's residential community was not designed to support automobile traffic during its planning in the early 1970s. Automobile traffic has become common even though much of the island remains a car-free area. MTA buses Q102 route, operating between the island and Queens, obviates the need for automobiles to some extent. However, RIOC operates a free on-island shuttle bus service from apartment buildings to the subway and tramway, called the Red Bus, and completes directly with the Q102. The bright red buses are highly visible. Demographics: as of the 2000 census, Roosevelt Island had a population of 9,520. 52% of the population were female, and 4,525, or 48%, were male. The population was spread out with 5% under the age of 5, 20% under the age of 18, 67% between the ages of 18 and 65 and 15% over the age of 65. The racial makeup of the island was 45% white, 27% black, 14% Hispanics or Latinos of any race, 11% Asian or Pacific Islander, and 0.3% other races. The median income was $49,976. 37% had an income under $35,000. 40% had incomes between $35,001 and $99,999, and 23% had an income over $100,000. 55% of the total households were family households, and 45% were non-family households. 17% of the residents were married couples with children, and 19% were married couples without children. 36% of the households were one-person households, and 9% were two or more non-family households. 3% were male-based households with related and unrelated children, and 16% were female-based households with related and unrelated children. Government and infrastructure. The neighborhood is part of Manhattan Community Board 8. The Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation operates and maintains the island's government and infrastructure. The United States Postal Service operates the Roosevelt Island Station at 694 Main Street. Waste on Roosevelt Island is collected by an automated vacuum collection system using a system of pneumatic tubes. This is the only AVAC system serving a residential complex in the United States. Education. Roosevelt Island, as with all parts of New York City, is served by the New York City Department of Education. Residents are zoned to PS 217/IS 217 Roosevelt Island School, which opened in 1992, combining together schools at various locations on the island. Also, the Child's School and Legacy High School serve Euro-12 special needs children with learning and emotional disabilities. On December 19, 2011, Mayor Michael Bloomberg announced that Cornell NYC Tech, a Cornell University Technion Israel Institute of Technology Graduate School of Applied Sciences, would be built on the island. The $2 billion facility will include 2 million square feet of space on an 11-acre city-owned site, which is currently used for a hospital. Classes will begin off-site in September 2012, with the first classes in the new facility scheduled to start in 2018. The campus will take almost 30 years to be fully complete. The New York Public Library operates the Roosevelt Island branch at 524 Main Street. The library began in a community room, then moved to its own building in 1979. In 1998, the library became a branch of the NYPL system. Media. Roosevelt Island has its own community newspaper, the Main Street Wire, founded in 1979 by Dr. Jack Resnick and published every 2 weeks. However, the Wire wasn't first published until 1981, following an accident that took the Roosevelt Island tramway out of service for several months, making travel to and from the island difficult. The incident was scarcely reported by major New York City news sources at the time, so Resnick and several other residents founded The Wire to report local news. The Wire derives its name from the first 4 residential buildings constructed on Roosevelt Island: Westview, Island House, Rivercross, and Eastwood. Current and back issues are available online. Volunteers deliver The Wire to every residential door in the community. The newspaper confines its coverage to Roosevelt Island matters, reporting on community concerns ignored by other New York City media, including issues that arise by virtue of Roosevelt Island being a community within New York City which is operated by the state of New York, with a local authority called the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation in charge. For several years, The Wire has editorialized in favor of a stronger element of elected home rule for the community, and various small steps have been taken in that general direction. Most recently, the Residents Association has been in the process of mounting an election which will serve to nominate members to the board of directors of the RIOC. The governor will retain the final nominating power, however. The newspaper is developed and produced every other week by community volunteers. Editors since its founding have included Dr. Resnick, the late Jim Bowser, and current editor-publisher Dick Lutz. Since its founding, The Wire's focus has always been principally on the Roosevelt Island community. It does not report on national or international news unless there is a direct and special effect on island residents. It is independent of both the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation and the Roosevelt Island Residents Association, though the president of each organization contributes a column. Resident letters are an important component of the Wire's editorial page, providing a forum for residents to comment on the performance of RIOC, which is a New York State agency. Since the mid-2000s, resident bloggers also provide community support by consolidating various important resources for local news, events, politics, and community issues, including development, transportation, and tourism. Notable residents and visitors. Prisoners: George Washington Dixon served 6 months for libel against Reverend Francis L. Hawkes, Becky Adelson for using threatening language during a speech, Emma Goldman several times, for activities in support of anarchism and birth control and against the World War I draft, Peter H. Matthews for operating policy games all over New York City, Madame Restel for performing abortions, Ida Craddock convicted for obscenity under the Comstock laws, Boss Tweed served 1 year on corruption-related charges, Mae West served 8 days on public obscenity charges for her play Sex, Billie Holiday served on prostitution charges, Fritz Jalbert Duquesne Nazi spy and leader of the Duquesne spy ring, the largest convicted espionage case in United States history, Dutch Schultz arrested for burglary, visitors who described conditions, Nellie Bly went undercover as a patient in the Women's Lunatic Asylum and reported what happened in the New York World as well as her book 10 Days in a Madhouse, Charles Dickens described conditions at the Octagon, an asylum for the mentally ill then located on the northern portion of the island. In his American Notes 1842, William Wallace Sanger oversaw police interviews of 2,000 prostitutes at Blackwell's Island and wrote up the findings in the History of Prostitution. Residents: Kofi Annan former United Nations Secretary-General, Michelle Bachelet former President of Chile and Executive Director of UN Women. Wendy Fitzwilliam former Miss Universe and former Miss Trinidad and Tobago, Buddy Hackett comedian, Grandpa Al Lewis of the Munsters, now deceased, Sarah Jessica Parker Sex and the City actress, Andrea Rosen comedian, Fez Whatley co-host of the Ron and Fez show on Sirius XM satellite radio, Jonah Bobo actor, Sonia Braga actress, Michael Brodsky author, Timothy J. Keller Christian author and minister, in popular culture. Literature, 1867 in Chapter 13 of Horatio Alger's novel Ragged Dick, or, Street Life in New York with the Boot Blacks, the character Mickey Maguire, a young tough from 5 Points had acquired an ascendancy, sick among his fellow professionals, and had a gang of subservient followers, whom he led on to acts of ruffianism, not infrequently terminating in a month or two at Blackwell's Island. 1893 in the opening chapter of Stephen Crane's novelette Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, a worm of yellow convicts is seen emerging from a prison building on Roosevelt Island. 1904 in O. Henry's short story The Cop and the Anthem, the main character, a homeless man named Soapy, schemes to have himself arrested so as to spend a harsh winter serving a 3-month sentence in Blackwell's Island prison. 1922 Yank, the main character in Eugene O'Neill's comedy The Hairy Ape, is imprisoned in Blackwell's Island prison, in Chapter Virgin Islands US. 1925 Roosevelt Island appears in F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel The Great Gatsby as Blackwell's Island, in Chapter 4, when Nick and Jay drive into Manhattan via the Queensboro Bridge. 2001 Roosevelt Island's ruins, particularly the smallpox hospital and the Strucker Memorial Laboratory, play a central role in Linda Fairstein's police procedural novel The Dead House. 2004 A significant scene in Caitlin Arkinen's story Riding the White Bull takes place on Roosevelt Island. 2005 in the novel by Caroline B. Cooney, Code Orange, the main character, Mitty, is studying smallpox for his own survival. He goes and visits the smallpox hospital ruins on Roosevelt Island. 2007 in the novel by Cassandra Clare, City of Bones, the protagonist is drawn to the island for a showdown with the elusive villain, Valentine. film, 1932 a Paramount Pictures film entitled No Man of Her Own is released, a light comedy film starring Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. Upon learning that Gable's character is not in South America, but instead learns he has negotiated a deal to serve 90 days and he's across the river, Lombard's character then looks out of her hotel window to a view across the East River and the Queensboro Bridge, later referring to this as Blackwell's Island. 1939 a Warner Brothers film entitled Blackwell's Island is released. It stars John Garfield as a crusading reporter investigating corruption in the island's prison. 1966 in the film Mr. Budwing, a sign posted on a bridge in the film reads Stairway to Welfare Island. Suzanne Pleshette, playing the character Grace, tries to throw herself off the bridge wearing nothing but a fitted trench coat and white ankle boots, before James Garner's character saves her. 1981 a Roosevelt Island tramway car is held hostage in the Sylvester Stallone film Nighthawks. 1983 the 1983 Italian B-movie Escape from the Bronx has a scene filmed at the north end of the island. 1985 in the final scenes of the film Turk 182 the Timothy Hutton character swings above Roosevelt Island on the Queensboro Bridge. 1990 in the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, exterior shots of the Renwick ruins are used as the fictitious location for the Foot Clan's secret hideout. 1991 in the opening scene of City Slickers Billy Crystal's character Mitch Robbins is shown commuting to work via the Roosevelt Island tram. 1993 in the film For Love or Money, Doug Ireland wants to buy the abandoned hotel at the south end of Roosevelt Island, referring to the ruins of the smallpox hospital. 1994 in the professional Matilda Lando takes the tramway to Roosevelt Island to seek asylum at the Spencer School. 1997 the film Conspiracy Theory was shot on location in and around New York City. Sites included Times Square, Union Square, Greenwich Village, the Queensboro Bridge, Roosevelt Island, and the Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla, New York. 2002 near the end of the film Spider-Man, the Green Goblin blows up the Roosevelt Island side tram station and leaves a group of children hanging inside one car. He also brings Spider-Man down to fight with him in the abandoned smallpox hospital on the island. The tram and the island make other appearances in Spider-Man media. The island is featured in the video game Spider-Man 2. In The Amazing Spider-Man number 161 and number 162, appearing on the cover of the latter, and Spider-Man and Hulk fight on Roosevelt Island in The Amazing Spider-Man number 328. 2002 in the film Gangs of New York, Leonardo DiCaprio's character Amsterdam Vallen is seen leaving Hellgate House of Reform, Blackwell's Island, New York City. 2003 in the film Anything Else, Woody Allen's character, David Dobell, is a schoolteacher who lives on the island. 2005 Roosevelt Island is the setting for the film Dark Water by Brazilian director Walter Salles, where Dahlia moves into a low-rent apartment with her daughter and then is terrorized by the ghost of a girl that used to live upstairs. 2007 in the film The Brave One, starring Jodie Foster, a memorable scene takes place at the Roosevelt Island parking lot. The film mentions the island several times. Television, 1963 in the Carrier episode of Naked City, a woman escapes from a chronic care hospital on Welfare Island as it was then called to carry a rare disease through the borough of Queens. 2005 in the second season episode of CSI, NY called Dancing with the Fishes, a crime is committed inside the Roosevelt Island tram. 2010 on the TV show 24, NYCTU is based on Roosevelt Island. 2010 the reality TV show America's Next Top Model filmed a photo shoot on the Roosevelt Island tram on April 7, 2011 the television series Unforgettable takes place in part on Roosevelt Island. 2012 the season 3 finale of White Collar is set largely on Roosevelt Island, including a stunt in which the show's protagonist jumps mid-air between tram cars to avoid being captured by the FBI. Video games, 1992 in the final level of the video game Atomic Runner for the Sega Mega Drive Genesis. The level takes place on Roosevelt Island South Point Park, 2008 in the video game Grand Theft Auto 4 there is an island resembling Roosevelt Island, named Colony Island. It also includes the ruins of a hospital, similar to the smallpox hospital. There is also a replica of the tram available for players to ride. 2011 parts of the video game Crisis 2 take place on Roosevelt Island. Other, 1973 and most Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon videos. Roosevelt Island can be seen during a sequence in the song US Anthem with footage taken on top of the Queensboro Bridge. 1986 the King Kong tramway ride at Universal Studios Hollywood opens, featuring the Roosevelt Island tram. Another version of the ride would open at Universal Studios Florida in 1990. 2006 the fictional high school which the main characters attend in the GONZO anime series Red Garden is on Roosevelt Island. 2009 on May 23, the island was the site of Improv Everywhere's MP3 Experiment 6. Approximately 4,500 people traveled to the island to take part in a performance art piece where the southernmost point of the island became a battleground for the reenactment of a fictional melee between townspeople and an ancient wolf. See also: Theodore Roosevelt Island, Washington, D.C., United States Presidential Memorial, Notes. References. External links: RIOC Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation, Parks and Recreation. RIOC. Events, Memberships, Permits A. RIRA Online. Roosevelt Island Residents Association RIRA Online on Twitter. Community Resources, News, Events, Issues, Main Street Wire, Timeline of Island History. The Main Street Wire A. Roosevelt Islander. Rick Icanara, Roosevelt Islander on Twitter. Other, Roosevelt Island 360 photo tour of Roosevelt Island. Greg Goodman 1903 Panorama of Blackwell's Island, Library of Congress, Thomas A. Edison Motion Picture, The Island Nobody Knows, a fully digitized exhibition catalog about Roosevelt Island from the Metropolitan Museum of Art Libraries.